We got to set up for this shot first. Moving like a limb will kind of come out from behind the glass. It looks a little warm.
What happens when you take Panasonic's new flagship camera, designed for excellence in photo and video, and thrust it immediately into a fast-paced, high-stakes environment? This is what I foolishly asked myself when the S1R II landed on my lap. I'm not here to take pictures of birds and buildings. I'm here to push the camera in a way that can only be done when you have limited time and high expectations. A professional body in a professional environment. Can the S1R II pull users away from Canon, Nikon, or Sony? I believe that it can, but it's not a clean sweep either. Step inside our fashion shoot where we had to bounce back and forth between high-resolution photo and video, exploiting the maximum that this camera has to offer. We'll also discuss the video files with a professional colorist to see how well this new sensor and color science holds up. When it comes to high-end video or cinema production, Panasonic has always been there. But it's never really been the first pick for the professional full-frame photography crowd. Well, that was of course until the launch of the S-line cameras in partnership with Leica. Yet, Canon, Sony, Nikon continue to reign supreme for real pro photographers. But if you're not one of those brands, then you're always kind of looking to unseat the kings, and it takes a camera like the S1R II to do it. I'm gonna walk you through what this camera was like to use and what I think its strengths and weaknesses are, and where there still might be better options for you depending on your needs. But first, the hit list. The S1R II is more than just an upgrade. It's a whole new camera with a fresh 44.3 megapixel full-frame sensor. Improved performance courtesy of the new L2 technology processor that works faster and delivers cleaner images. This beast now goes to 40 frames per second of continuous shooting with no blackout, and is now a video powerhouse with loads of options up to 8K, including internal ProRes and ProRes RAW. Improved autofocus with 779-point phase hybrid autofocus with advanced AI tech, recognizing just about anything that moves. Handholders rejoice, the S1R II's weather-resistant design is a full 220 grams lighter than the original and sports up to 8 stops of stabilization. For video shooters, the S1R II is the first full-frame camera to deliver 32-bit float audio with the additional audio module. The robust free-angle LCD screen knows no boundaries by adapting to every type of shooting situation and can steer itself clear, giving ample room for cables. All of this and a whole lot more with the Panasonic Lumix S1R II. There's so much to discuss with this new camera with a heap of new and improved functionality, but I'm going to try to focus on the ones that stood out to me and the ones that I believe matter the most to you. First one, of course, has to be ease of use. This is a pro camera, and that means that it has so much power and so many options that it can feel overwhelming at times, particularly if this is your first pro body. Yet, when I compare it to the Canon R5 II, I actually found it navigating the settings to be much more instinctual and quicker overall. Being a professional these days means that you're likely asked to shoot both photo and video, which has become a portion of my work. The goal here is always to reduce downtime when changing, not just between modes, but between resolutions and frame rates. And in our shoot, the pace was such that I often forewent pulling off my map box and transmitter when moving to photos.
We're gonna get a model in a few moments, and we're gonna start with photos as a way just to warm up the model as well, and then we'll move into video. So the trick for the day is really just how do we move as quickly as possible from photo to video, especially because a lot of video setups are quite involved.
Like all cameras, setting up the custom dials is the answer, and what I love about the S1R II is that each custom bank is reflective of your mode setting. That means 7 available banks for each photo, video, and S&Q modes. You will see that I actually had to put a cheat sheet on the back of the camera since I only really had a couple of days to familiarize myself with the camera before my shoot. The dials and buttons all made sense to me, and possibly this is the most intuitive experience I've had with a professional body that I just don't shoot with on a regular basis. Nothing infuriates me more with pro bodies than the ones that are just like too minimalist, hiding much of the functionality in the touchscreen or menu systems. And the S1R II strikes, I believe, that perfect balance. And finally, the texture and the body feel really bomb and slip-proof. Well, Butterfingers here, didn't drop it once. And now let's dive into the photo features. The camera takes an incrementally lower resolution hit in favor of a massive performance boost over its predecessor with an only 3 megapixel loss. The 44 megapixel continues to shine, delivering outstanding image fidelity and holds up to significant cropping. The S1R II also bests the R5 II's burst mode by 10 frames per second, pushing 40 blackout-free frames to Canon's 30. Very impressive for a camera released not long after the R5 II. If there's one area where brands like Canon and Sony come out ahead, it's autofocus. In fact, Panasonic was one of the very last to step up their autofocus, which must have cost them a lot of sales to the benefit of the big three. Though once again, I have to say that in all of my testing and shooting, Panasonic appears to be precisely on par with everyone else, judging by how it performed against the R5 II. Yes, it doesn't have that eye tracking tech that Canon does, but in my experience, the feature can be a bit of a novelty depending on kind of what you're shooting. So I would say having smart and intuitive autofocus is more valuable across the board in all use cases. I want to talk about video now because for one, it's what I know best, and where I also have the highest expectations and the lowest tolerance for shenanigans. Video is also the biggest upgrade over the S1R, which didn't really do any meaningful video at all. What this camera does is give you more or less the same functionality as the S5 IIX, but with a higher resolution. This does, of course, come at a cost to dynamic range. The S5 IIX has more than 14 stops, which is helpful for highlight retention or signal-to-noise management. With the higher resolutions, we only get 14 stops on the S1R II. And it also comes at a cost because the video quality is actually optimized for 13 stops. This is because Panasonic gives you the option to select a dynamic range extended mode to get that additional stop of range, but with the compromise that it worsens your rolling shutter performance and limits your codec options. Considering though who the target of this camera is, I think 13 or 14 is actually more than enough, though this is an important detail to some and should be considered. In our video, I actually shot the 13 stop version to preserve the rolling shutter performance. It was a lighting controlled environment as most are, and so I didn't really have to worry about maximizing that dynamic range. The camera has a remarkable selection of resolutions, frame rates, and codecs, though I would say that for those buying this camera because it does 8K, you should stop and consider one thing. The S5 IIX does 6K, and as I mentioned, with greater dynamic range. When I tested all the resolutions, I was surprised to see that there was a noticeable improvement from 4K to 5.9K, but virtually no perceivable boost from there to 8K. I would say that if you are mostly a video shooter, that you should head straight for the S5 IIX and all but pass on this model, except for that darn 32-bit float audio. I covered this in my GH7 review, so I won't go into it deeply here. Go to that review if you want samples or to learn more. However, Panasonic is still the only brand to offer this feature in camera. So if you record audio like corporate or documentary work, then this is a big deal. You do have to buy the additional audio module, but if you do that kind of work, you're gonna want it anyways. Let's turn our attention now to video quality overall. This part is objective and subjective. Let's talk objective first. The S1R II introduces a new picture profile called Cine A2. When comparing it to the Cine-like D2 or V2, as well as Rec 709, we can note that the A2 is the least saturated, but the most accurate color. Now that doesn't automatically make it more pleasing or better, it's just the color vectors line up the best. In terms of gamma curve, the A2 has a similar highlight retention to the D2, but the midtones are raised, and there is a slight rise as well in the blacks. I would consider this profile an even softer version of Cine-like D2. Comparing the respective log gammas and gamuts, we can see that Canon's is more saturated in some areas and higher contrast in the shadows. Neither is better than the other, and the point of log is that there's ample room for subjective manipulation. I've gotten very good images out of both brands, and one of my favorite pieces of work was shot on the R5. Subjectively, however, I do prefer a less saturated image, and we can see where Canon spikes in the reds in particular. This is one of the areas where I've always had to pull down saturation when shooting Canon, and it's nice to have a more balanced image with Panasonic. Now is a great time for me to stop pretending that I know what I'm talking about and turn to a real colorist for his take on the footage that came out of the S1R II. Mike Gamble is a commercial and narrative colorist, and most truthfully, he is one of my absolute favorites to work with.
I want to first get your sense about, your first impressions of playing with the footage, what you liked about it, and where some of the challenges were.
Everything was really well organized, really well shot, really well lit. So it gave me a good basis to kind of see where your head was at in the shoot. So I didn't really feel like I had to go too crazy to get some really nice skin tones out of it, some really nice looks, just essentially opening things up, opening up the shadows just to get a bit more of that detail back.
But one of the challenges that we faced on is that we're just moving super, super quick. And typically, you've worked with me enough to know that like I typically like to overexpose my log footage by a stop or two. That gives us a lot more detail in the shadows, and then we can crush that down if we need to. This was a case where sometimes I wouldn't even look at my settings. I look at the monitor and be like, that looks good enough. Let's go, because we're moving so quickly. In this particular case, that means the shadows were a bit darker. Could you pull any information out of there, or were we restricted a little bit?
We were quite restricted. There was a lot of information that was just crushed in the blacks. We couldn't really open it up to the point where we were retaining just that nice smooth roll off from the very bottom end into the shadows. It was starting to lift and just to gray out quite quickly.
What you're seeing there, we were shooting the 13 stop version. And do you think that if we had another 2 stops that maybe I could have dug something out of the shadows there?
I mean, there's a good possibility of it, yeah. It depends on where the split of the dynamic range is with this camera, whether it is directly in the middle or whether it's a highlight or shadow weighted.
The situations in which you need the dynamic range the most is typically run and gun or music videos or docs, that kind of thing. In a controlled studio environment like we had, that's less of a concern. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. 13 stops is still a lot of stops. Like, it's a huge range. One stop is going to give you a little bit more flexibility. As you say, in a documentary scenario, when you're running around, you may not hit the exposure straight away. Like, it gives you that flexibility in post for that and in the real world. But for studio and controlled environments, I think 13 is more than enough.
I shot it pretty warm in some scenarios, and you had asked me about it. You're like, did you intend to shoot it this warm? So you had played around with the color temperature a little bit. Give me a sense of how much latitude you had in moving that color temperature around.
We're getting swings from 2600 kelvins to 5600, and I wasn't noticing any breaking down. I was moving the whole signal across from insanely warm all the way back to neutral, and I was getting perfect color contrast between the outfits. I was seeing the original colorways, the jewelry, the sparkle, skin tones were coming back without any real loss of information.
There are a few other points to make about the S1R II, sort of an honorable mentions list, especially for those who may be unfamiliar with the Panasonic system. Panasonic has a strong video heritage and has always been among the very first to prioritize high-quality video functionality in their mirrorless cameras. Now, it's been some time since the release of the S5 II and subsequent cameras that sport the real-time LUT feature. This is a great look customization tool that applies to both photo and video, and the camera allows for 39 storage banks. If you want to know more, I covered this in our S5 II review. The camera also has the option to close the shutter when turned off to prevent any type of dust or potential damage to the sensor when removing lenses. Like Fujifilm Pro cameras, the S1R II also supports Frame IO integration and tethering to Capture One, as well as a host of smart device apps, which you can read about somewhere because I don't have the time or the patience to discuss them. Okay, let's wrap this up. Here is how I know if a camera is designed well or poorly. If I bravely trust it enough to take it on a real job and it doesn't fluster me or let me down, then I know it can handle just about anything. With most cameras I test, there are always blunders and compromises, but I felt nearly none of that with this model. One area of concern for me, and I think for many users, will be the sometimes overabundance of options that you are presented with. The menu system is well designed, but the options can feel quite overwhelming. This is partially rectified through the camera's generous customization options, and the issue ameliorates with familiarization. But I'd be concerned that it's still easy to miss some critical features. Another issue of note is that, like many Panasonic cameras, the S1R II also has a dual gain sensor, but it's simply not clear what the base ISO is for each gain level. To make it even more confusing, it's impossible to say what the camera is precisely doing when you select auto in the dual gain category. Arguably, it's just choosing the best version of, say, 1600 ISO. But what is that doing to the dynamic range or signal to noise ratio? And without an expensive Xyla chart, it's challenging to come to any conclusion. What makes cinema cameras notably so powerful is that there's a clear idea of what your gain is doing to both your signal and to your gray point. Canon, to their credit, actually publishes this information. Speaking of Canon, they are certainly not the only target here. Sony and Nikon have equally compelling models we could compare to, and in every situation, there is going to be a resounding case to go with one brand over the other. No brand, no model can claim complete dominance, especially now more than ever. I chose the R5 Mark II as the comparison point because, well, I've had a lot of success with Canon, and I've always seen Canon as the champion, sort of, when it comes to no compromise blending of photo and video in their pro cameras, though certainly many of you would claim that Sony holds that honor. Needless to say, I was truly surprised to see how this camera really came out of the gate with all burners on. It's $1,200 Canadian cheaper than that of the R5 Mark II, and as far as I can tell, there are only a few resounding reasons to buy the R5 II over the S1R II. One is dynamic range. The Canon camera is going to give you 14.8 stops without compromise. And another is the R5 Mark II does 8K video at 60 frames per second versus the 30 of the S1R II. And lastly, simply, you just like Canon color science better. For those who are ardent Panasonic fans but find yourself much more in the video realm, I don't see much advantage to the minimal resolution boost of the S1R II over the S5 IIX, though if you record any audio whatsoever, then the 32-bit audio option makes the S1R II an absolute slam dunk. I really love shooting with this camera. Myself and my team were so impressed with the quality of the photos and the videos of this camera as well. It was a real joy to use and felt so easy to navigate and operate. This is by far the most impressive Panasonic camera I've ever used, and is most certainly a harbinger of exciting things to come for the brand. For me, for now, I'm out. Peace.